am Hadley Ray, and I am doing a review of Forrest Gump. It is directed by Robert Zemeckis, made in 1994, and starring Tom Hanks, or you may know him as Woody. Now, within Forrest Gump, there is a lot of dilemmas, things like innocence and realism, with Forrest Gump being the main caveat of that, and then also the political engagement of the country during the time. It was during Vietnam, and everybody was going to war, and not a lot of people agreed with why we were there and what we were doing. So the ethical dilemmas in this movie are very important, honestly, to American history as a whole. Going to the realism and innocence of Forrest Gump, we all need to realize who Forrest Gump is. He's a boy who grew up in Alabama during the time, and there was a lot of bullying towards him because of his low IQ and his disability with his legs. Until one day he finally started running with his legs after being chased by his bullies. It's honestly quite, cool seeing that. But also see him talk about Jenny, which was his childhood friend growing up, and later would go on to have a somewhat romantic relationship with him. It would be on and off though throughout the movie, because they would just be doing separate things throughout the movie. While Gump would be, in war, she would be following the activist movement at the time for peace, instead of, advocating for more war against the Vietnam, which that's where we bring in the political side of Forrest Gump. And like I said, it's very political during this time because many Americans did not want us to go to Vietnam. Even the soldiers didn't want to go, but most of them were forced to go. So while, Gump, him always fighting for things, even when he never noticed it, being a kid and, running away from the bullies, fighting off what they think about him, about thinking he has a low IQ and that, he can't run as well as the other kids. But he also fought in college when he was a running back. Most of the guys, they just saw him as some other guy that would just go on and, do nothing, be a bench warmer, but he was probably most likely, honestly, the best football player that's been around in years during that time. But then he would later go on to fight in our military and become a soldier. While in our U.S. military, Gump would meet a man named Bubba. They would become very good friends, and then we learn about Bubba and about how he had a shrimp fishing family. That's basically where he came from, was shrimp fishing. And once he was done with the war, he would want to go on and, run a restaurant and doing that. But little did we know that would come to a very short end when he would die in war. But that wouldn't stop Forrest for looking for his friend that he's made since Jenny, actually. Those two were honestly the only friends he's had. So he would not stop until he found him, and later he did, and he also found Lieutenant Dan, who's also going to become a very pivotal role for Gump later in his life after the military service. But once we're done with the military service, Gump eventually he comes home from the service, and he doesn't really know what he's talking about. So when he's up there on the podium talking to the peach protest, as he's trying to go, we see a man in uniform start unplugging all of the cords. So we have no clue what he might have said during that speech, good or bad. Maybe he enjoyed the war, maybe he hated it. We don't know because of his innocence inside of his mind. The only thing he was thinking about was keeping Bubba protected and saving Lieutenant Dan. So we never really got clarification whether he fought for it or he was against it. But later on, once everyone's done cheering for him about how good of a job he did while he was up there, we finally see Jenny, who starts yelling Forrest Gump's name out in the audience, and he's looking to see who's yelling his name when he finally recognizes it's Jenny, running through the Washington Monument's water, as we finally see them reunite again, and they proceed to hug it off. Now, this is what I want to bring back to about the political dilemma in this movie. We have the Peace March that started around 1975 when the Vietnam War ended, but before this we actually had Martin Luther King's March on the Washington Monument in '63, and now this is huge to America's history and its political agenda at the time of don't speak against the man or else you will be punished. As we saw with Forrest Gump, the strings were pulled out right from underneath him. He didn't have what he wanted to say because someone pulled out the strings. And then Martin Luther King's March, he was later assassinated. So during this time, you couldn't really speak out about the U.S. or else you would either be quieted or you would just simply be killed off. which is this is during a time when you couldn't really speak out. Next up in Forrest Gump's life and his adventure would be him becoming a ping pong champion. This would happen while he was recovering in a military base hospital. He would go on and try to improve the troops' morale and cheer them up while they were recovering and play ping pong against the other players. Now this could honestly be a very good way for them to get some physical therapy and while they're having fun while doing it, and your wrist motions and your hands and your nerves. So honestly, what he did was a really good thing, and it was pure innocence and him having fun doing it instead of the realism aspect of it. The realism aspect would just be the therapy, but for him, this was a fun thing to do, and you never noticed the advantages of it. He would also go on to play in other military bases and tournaments and go to China, where he would beat their best ping pong players and go to be a world champion in ping pong. And then once he was done with that in the military and overall with all of the social aspects of being out in the open, he would go on to start a shrimping business as he was going to do with Bubba. But sadly Bubba passed away, so in his memory he did it instead and named the boat Jenny. He would also meet Lieutenant Dan and they would go on a shrimping boat adventure together essentially and make money doing it, growing a monopoly, and the Bubba Gump shrimp business is a real thing today. So that back to the political, this created economy and even real life, how this movie gave us a real life shrimping business when people thought maybe it was even impossible for it to happen. To get to another sad part of the movie would be when Forrest's mom perishes from cancer. This was probably one of the hardest things Forrest has ever dealt with, even than the bullying in the Vietnam War, because the detrimental it had on him, essentially breaking his innocence, making him go on the 3-year run. But something else important that she left him with was the quote of "life is a box of chocolates and you never know what you're gonna get." And this set him up for not to let your life be a constant circle of nothingness, essentially, of where you're doing the same routine every day. So he wanted to do something new, something that no one's ever done in a way, and make it exponential. And so that's where we would start his 3-year run. As I was saying, he would run to get his mind off everything: the war, Jenny, the business, his mother. He would run across the country and make friends along the way, and people would even start the run. And even though he was trying to get out of the public view by doing this and getting away from America soon followed him. At the end of his run though, when they asked, "What do we do now?" he said, "I guess I go home," ending in a very mundane and blunt way of just saying, "I don't want to do this anymore." And I was talking about his circle of routine. This was his routine. And he finally wanted to break it after getting his mind off of his mother. I also forgot to note, Jenny would come by his house during this time after his mother died, and he would finally confess his love for her. But doing this, she actually had left with the overwhelming feelings of this after having her lifelong best friend tell her about that he feels a certain way for her that he has since they were children and when he hugged her at the monument. So this would finally go into where we were at in the beginning of the movie when he was talking with the woman, the stranger that he met, and how he would tell strangers his life story, how he just told us his life story and everything that's been happening. So now we're caught up. And he would tell the woman life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're gonna get. He finally meets Jenny again and she reveals that they have a son together. This is a very odd, maybe even disturbing experience for us to see after she had left him that last time before his 3-year run. So seeing the kid once made Gump feel a little uncomfortable for, why were you never around during this time to tell me? Why did you never come back to tell me? But then they have settled it out and then they soon got married. Finally, we were waiting for it. And then sadly though, Jenny gets HIV. She's had it actually. So a couple later years go on and she passes away, leaving the son for Forrest to handle on his own, which is probably the hardest thing that he's gonna do in his life. Raising a child on his own is gonna be very expensive with no help at all, other than maybe Lieutenant Dan was gonna be his only help through this predicament that he's found himself in. But knowing Gump, he's still gonna try his hardest to take care of this kid because of his innocence. He will never allow this kid to be on his own. But versus the realism of how hard this is going to be for him. And then back to the political dilemma of trying to pay for a kid on your own and how the government might screw him over in a way. But in the end, Forrest Gump has taught us all a lesson of life's like a box of chocolates. You don't know what you're going to get. You could either end up in life and having a great life and being very successful like Forrest, or your life could be as miserable as Jenny's, where you got caught up in bad situations at the wrong time. It also teaches us to break us of our routines that we do every day. I want us to do something inspirational every day for somebody, as he did for the ping pong tournament. If you make someone's day better every day, that will lead on into other people's day and make their day better. And then more creativity for people. When he did his 3 mile run, it's creative, it's new. People 3 mile run. And I think if we all follow Forrest Gump example of, the innocence part, even of still staying a kid, but versus the realism of trying to be an adult at the same time, is inspirational almost.